The call is now given to the Honourable Member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Mineral Resource Rent Tax Bill 2011 and the associated legislation. The Minerals Resource Rent Tax is a project-based tax on economic rents for mining companies who make profits from taxable resources, and that is iron ore, coal and some gases. The tax is imposed on a mining company's mining profit, less its MRT allowances at a rate of 22.5%. These bills were only introduced in the last sitting period, and although they may have been in development since the Rudd government, there is no way that we could possibly evaluate the impact of this tax on our own electorates and the small to medium-sized businesses within it. Any uncertainty or lack of investment by the large mining companies will see many of these businesses suffer. They now compete against overseas contractors and companies to supply the mining sector. They do not need another albatross to be hung around their neck, such as a resource tax that may have consequential flow-ons and unintended consequences. It's interesting with the resource development, and certainly within my own state, there are tiers within the nexus of companies exploring and developing and creating the economic development. But on the other hand, creating supply demand that is raising prices exponentially in a way that makes it very challenging for locals. And if you want to look at cost impost, is the service provision by state and territory governments in whereby police, education, health have to pay extraordinary rents for properties. I agree with the Minister when he states that minerals in the ground are for all Australians, and this is a very worthy reason for looking at our national interests. So I wonder why the Minister wants to implement this tax on companies, which will just result in them seeking cheaper input alternatives, even if this means going offshore. Governments must support our small to medium-sized businesses that are at the beck and call of mining companies. There are many excellent local businesses in my electorate that contribute to the mining sector. I want to bring to the attention of the House several businesses that will be impacted upon by the mining tax in Hasluck. HVLV is a switchboard manufacturer in Haslemere. They are a local company with local staff and employ many apprentices. I've met with them on several times and have always been impressed by their professionalism and the quality of work and their competitiveness against international companies who make similar products. Mr. Deputy Speaker, even before the mining tax has been implemented, Steve DeMold was expressing his concern that his business has been in the situation where they have lost tenders to cheaper offshore alternatives. Dicko Harding from Oranstone is also in Haslemere, and he has on several occasions expressed his concern about the introduction of this tax, just when the economy seems to be picking itself back up after the global financial crisis. Pilbara Access Group, led by Stephen Eastbrook, has just moved its training operations into South Guildford. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Pilbara Access Group is a high-quality scaffolding service for large mining sites. Their emphasis is on the provision of quality training and an extremely high safety standard. They operate a number of training programs for apprentices and Aboriginal people, and it would be a pity if they were to be affected by this tax, and a disgrace if the government let this happen. Jeremy and Ian from Austrac have also expressed their concerns, as did Westrac and Barminco. Whilst I could talk about the numerous local businesses that would be affected, I would only have limited time, which in a way is disappointing because I care about these businesses and their workers. Hasluck has a large proportion of fly-in, fly-out workers, commonly referred to as FIFOs. Many of these families rely on the one income, and any variation in this will see a number of families enter periods of hardship if employment opportunities are limited because companies make the decision not to expand their operations. These families do not deserve to be treated with contempt by the Gillard government. They are making a living for themselves and looking after their families. We should support them as much as possible. I am concerned that this new tax will create job uncertainty and a potential loss of jobs offshore, and I certainly will fight for those families in Hasluck who rely on the important industry sector for their quality of life. The Premier of Western Australia, Mr Colin Barnett, increased the royalty concession from iron ore and has blown a $2 billion black hole in the Treasurer's budget. Again, the decision in New South Wales to increase royalties will put a $1 billion black hole in the budget. So we have the capacity for states and territories to continually look at the opportunities of resources within their respective states and territories and the contribution that they will derive from royalties that will provide the type of services that they are obligated to provide to their citizens. Mr Speaker, again in Tasmania and South Australia, the respective state governments have increased their royalties. Every time a state or territory raises its royalties, this blows a massive hole in the Treasurer's budget. It is a long and slippery slope once the government declares war on the states and territories. It is a state's constitutional right to determine how royalties are used and derived in their state. Mr Ken Henry confirmed that the Gillard government never sought advice on the constitutional validity of the mining tax. There has been no consultation with any of the state and territory governments about the implications of the mining tax on them. This is an unfair tax, Mr Deputy Speaker, especially to Western Australia. My West Australian colleagues and I will be advocating hard for the people of our great state. Royalties represent 20% of the WA state government revenue. This is extremely significant considering the infrastructure needs of the state and, in particular, infrastructure upgrades required at the local level. Due to this incredible unfairness in distribution, it brings about the question of discrimination between the states, thus presenting a potential constitutional crisis for the Gillard government. Already, the West Australian government has signalled that they will pursue a High Court action should the mining tax be passed. A sensible option to this mess would be to sit down with state and territory governments, and let's not forget that Australia is premised on an agreement to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown and Constitution. And the purpose, or the mechanism that I see, is COAG, which is to enable the Commonwealth and state and territory leadership to come together to establish and agree to a national approach, which in this case is to pursue genuine tax reform that is of common agreement and not Commonwealth-led. But no, this government, which does not prefer to consult and do things properly, sets that aside. The recent tax forum had the mining tax as off-limits, along with the carbon tax which lacks logic. I would think that it would be logical to have tax forum participants to have the opportunity to discuss the whole scope of taxes so that we could consider as a House those elements that would see genuine reform in taxation in this country. Two of the biggest taxes we've ever seen were off-limits to a forum on tax reform in Australia. I find this inexcusable in our system of democracy, Mr Deputy Speaker. Instead, key negotiations were left to the government and the three biggest mining companies. This is incredibly divisive for the mining sector. All participants should have been included. And what has come from these secret negotiations? A tax which is only on iron ore and coal, is another 287 pages of tax laws and gives an unfair competitive advantage to the big three companies who were allowed to design the tax. And the Gillard Greens Alliance will create another industry for compliance officers and even more public sector working officers to service this mess that divides the industry and takes nearly 2/3 of its revenue from just one state, Western Australia. Who can forget the Treasurer on the 10th of May this year when, during his budget speech, he promised that the budget would be brought back in black by 2012-2013. What we do know is that the future revenue from the MRRT will be highly volatile and downward trending. Over the first year since the mining tax was first announced, revenue estimates have jumped from around 12 billion RSPC, 24 billion RSPC with revised commodity price assumptions, to 10.5 billion post-Gillard mining tax deal and the commodity price assumptions, to 7.4 billion post-exchange rate changes, to 7.7 billion post-further exchange rate changes. This indecision and guesswork is unacceptable at the smaller level that we've already seen from this bad government getting worse. Now, their modelling and predisposition for making mistakes will be applied to the gigantic, big new tax on a profitable sector of our industry and economy. Mr Deputy Speaker, it looks like government needs a miracle to get its budget back to surplus, and this new tax will create the illusion in next year's budget. But in the medium to long term, the budget will be much worse off. The Senate inquiry, which was chaired by my colleague and fellow West Australian, Senator Matthias Cormann, conservatively estimated that the net cost to the budget by the mining tax will be $20 billion. Another quick fix by an incompetent government who cannot stop themselves from spending more and more of the taxpayers' money. This tax is punishing an industry which helped us through the global financial crisis. This is an industry which defines modern Australia, of which many of our people are involved with. We should be helping them rather than hitting them with a significant tax. I listened to the Minister when he referred to a superannuation arrangement in the being derived out of the new tax in question time. And it's interesting that in the Australian, on Monday the 21st, the 11th of 2011, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has put the argument in perspective in its submission to the House of Representatives Economics Committee on superannuation. The boost to superannuation, the Chamber points out, will be paid by employers through the superannuation guarantee levy, which rises from 9% to 12% between 2013 and 14 and 2019 and 2020. The Chamber expects the superannuation levy bill will ultimately cost employers $20 billion a year. But employers fear that the 1% cut in the corporate tax will fall short of the cost that the higher superannuation levy. Now, look, the intent of the legislation is understood from what has been presented, and certainly parliamentary colleagues on the other side who have spoken on this matter have raised what they see as the benefits. But one of the challenges we have with legislation in this chamber at times when it is rushed is we do not get the opportunity to analyse its content, its consequential flow-on effects, and also to try and ascertain what the risk management is in terms of unintended consequences. We're poised in a world global economy that has the influence of both the Eurodollar and the American debt. And should they waver, then our capacity to climb out of a global financial crisis is certainly likely to be limited. And to that end, it is a pity that we are not looking at the opportunities that value adds to the resources that come out of the ground. I know we talk of, once we take resources out of the ground, that they're not replaced, but I don't see where we're value adding to those resources when they're taken out of the ground. I think that there is also a need to consider those secondary industries which will value add to the resources that are there. I strongly oppose the Mineral Resource Rent Tax Bill for 2011 and will stand up for the businesses and residents in my electorate of Hasluck, and certainly would welcome the opportunity of a greater transparency in this legislation and a consideration of those risk factors that might mitigate against the development of our economy, and also the strength that the mining sector brings currently to many of the small businesses that exist within this nation. And there's hope that we don't look back and say we had a great win from a government perspective, only to find that we have limited the opportunity for our future generations. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.